Hi again, everybody. This is Dr. Jenkins, and here we go. Another video coming up here on the respiratory system. And I certainly hope that that isn't you. Okay. We are coming down the home stretch. I know it's kind of been a long journey going body system by body system. So I just want to encourage you to stick with it. We're coming towards the end, but please keep your foot on the gas. You want to do well right up until the end. All right, so the respiratory system. I think in a lot of ways, this chapter can be a little easier because there's less structures to know than, say, the digestive system, but it can be a little tricky. Once we get to the physiology, it can be a little tricky. So sometimes that sneaks up on people, and I want to be sure that you are spending enough time with it, okay? So be prepared. But we're going to start with some basic functions. Here we go. The respiratory system, as you know, brings in oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. I think it's easier to think about the importance of breathing in to bring in oxygen. And when we bring in oxygen, it goes into our lungs, it's transferred to the blood, and then that blood transports the oxygen to all of our cells, right? And our cells are little working factories that need oxygen. But maybe what people don't think of as much is that carbon dioxide. It is just as important, folks, if not more important. I mean, they're both really important, but we have to get rid of CO2, carbon dioxide. Our cells produce a byproduct of CO2. And if that builds up, it can turn the blood acidic in a heartbeat. And you could literally die. So it's just as important that the CO2 that builds up in the tissues gets sent to the blood, back to the lungs, where we can breathe it out. Just as important. And then, because of the ability to help get rid of CO2 and, in a sense, regulate CO2 levels, because of that, the respiratory system is a really huge regulator of pH. We utilize the respiratory and the urinary systems as our main body systems for pH regulation. So here in this chapter, we're going to be talking about the respiratory system. And how does it do it? Well, we can either increase or decrease respiratory rate to get rid of more or less CO2. If I increase my respiratory rate, I'm going to be able to breathe out more CO2. So an example, if the blood becomes too acidic, our respiratory rate will go up. So if my blood becomes too acidic, my body will increase respiratory rate for me, which means that I'm breathing out more CO2. And if I breathe out more of something that's acid, it'll bring the blood pH back to normal. Really, really important. Look at that function again. You know how sometimes I just put 2 slides? It's my way of saying it's really, 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 really important. All right, so just make sure you look at that. All right, let's talk about the anatomy. Let's take a trip, just like we took a trip down the digestive tract. Let's take a trip down the respiratory tract. As always, you should be looking at the basic structure and the basic function. I just stopped for a drink there, I'm sorry. Okay, we divide the respiratory tract into an upper respiratory tract and a lower. In most instances, just going to ignore that. In most instances, the trachea serves as the dividing line. Everything above the trachea is considered upper. Everything below the trachea is considered lower. However, sometimes you might see the line below the trachea. So I just don't want you to be surprised if you see that. But I think the more common rule of thumb is that the trachea, everything below the trachea and below is lower. Everything above the trachea is upper. So, upper. I think it'd be kind of fun to use a yellow today. It's fun to pick colors. It's the simple things, right? So we have the nose. I mean, folks, we know about the nose. This is our main intake for air. Of course, we can bring in some air, I'll use green, through the mouth also. But our main intake for air is the nose. And of course, lining the nasal cavity are little hairs. There's hairs all over the place. Those hairs are called cilia. The cilia help to filter the air. We're going to see a common trend. When we bring in that air, well, it could have particulates in it. It could be cold, all sorts of things. Too humid, not humid enough. So the idea of our upper respiratory tract is to clean that incoming air, filter out toxins or particulates. We also want to warm the incoming air so it's at a reasonable temperature once it gets to our lungs. And we also want to humidify it. So the nose is our intake. And as we'll see in all the upper respiratory tract, we begin the process of filtering the air, warming the air, and humidifying the air. To humidify means to add moisture. What we're going to find is once we get down to the lungs, we're going to actually purposely combine those gases with water as they are exchanged into the bloodstream. So it's helpful if we have that air be humidified and have a little moisture to it. Okay, then the air, well, it's going to go into the nose, nasal cavity, and then it reaches a region called the pharynx. So this area that I've put in yellow, is the pharynx. It has 3 regions. It goes down a little bit lower, I suppose. It's got 3 regions. The top one is the nasopharynx because it's closest to the nose. The middle region is the oropharynx because it's shared with the mouth. And the laryngopharynx is the lower region as it's about to enter the larynx. And it's structured very similar to the nose. There's going to be tiny little cilia everywhere. And it serves as a passageway, right? It's a passageway. And again, we're going to continue the action of filtering with the cilia, warming, and humidifying. This is, of course, what we would call the throat, but you're not going to call it that. You're going to call it the pharynx. Sometimes I throw in a cadaver picture, hope you don't mind, but this gives you a lot of perspective. And I think it's kind of cool because of that. So we can see the intake, I guess I can use yellow, the intake for our nose, right? And this is the nasal cavity. And then it's going to come into the pharynx. Here's the oropharynx, and here's the laryngopharynx. It's pretty narrow. And I just like this perspective because you get to see how everything is so close. I mean, right behind this, we have the esophagus. So what I'm coloring in green, that flat tube that actually is going to expand only when we put food in it. And then right behind that is the vertebral column. Behind that is let's see, what color can I use? Let's do white. Behind that is the spinal cord, which goes up to the brain. I mean, it's crazy. It's all squished in there, but it's cool. At least I think so. Okay. So we came in through the nose. We went through the pharynx. And now we get to a region known as the larynx. So I'm going to color it in yellow. It's a region. This is where we do house our voice box. I'm going to ignore that. This is where we house our larynx. The actual larynx is the voice box. So if I delete this, the larynx is going to be some flaps of tissue that sit in here. Let me go with yellow. It's going to be some flaps of tissue that sit in there. What are the functions of the larynx? Well, it continues to be a passageway. And guess what? It is lined with cilia that filters, warms, and humidifies the air. And of course, it houses the vocal cord. So please be reviewing what it is I'm pointing out. Everything else on this slide, on these slides, would be extra. I have some other views for you because I think they're helpful. So on the top left here, this is a side view, and the air would be coming down this way. Okay, and we can just see a side view, right? Behind it is the esophagus, behind the trachea. And then we can also see the actual vocal cords, which we're going to talk about in a minute, I believe. Maybe not. Did I talk about that? Okay, so the larynx houses the vocal cords. And folks, the vocal cords are just these two flaps of tissue. It literally looks like this and then that. Because lining that area, if you look down at the bottom right, this is an image. If we've taken a camera, an endoscope, you put a little scope down someone's mouth and their throat, their pharynx, into the larynx, and we see this view. So the vocal cords are simply these flaps of tissue that line the opening. So when we push air through this opening, those flaps of tissue, the vocal cords, they vibrate. And that's what produces sound. And we can move these in and out to produce all different types of sounds, right? And of course, this is so important. These vocal cords, these flaps of tissue are very delicate. So we have a big piece of cartilage on the front, right? A big piece of cartilage on the front to protect it. Technically, it's called the thyroid cartilage. You may have heard of it referred to as the Adam's apple. But just know there's a big piece of cartilage there to protect it. Here's what it looks like when we open and close that space. So as I said, these flaps are the vocal cords, and they line an opening, and we can move the vocal cords in, or we can move the vocal cords out, and that's how we change. Or change things to change our voice, the sound that comes out of our mouth. This is all extra, but I just like these pictures. Okay. It is important that we talk about the epiglottis. Let's get our bearings here. We brought in air through the nose. It traveled through the pharynx, and now we're getting into the larynx. So right at this junction between the pharynx and the larynx, there's a structure called the epiglottis. So I've colored it in pink. In the picture on the left, the epiglottis is in the open position, right? It's kind of shaped like that. When the epiglottis, which by the way is a piece of cartilage, when the epiglottis is in the open position, air comes down into the trachea because it's open. But what we're going to find as we go a little bit lower, the air is going to continue down the trachea, but right behind the trachea is the esophagus. So moving further down, we have anteriorly in the front, the trachea, which air goes down, yellow arrow. And then right behind it, posterior to it, we have the esophagus, green, which food goes down. Well, when food comes in, we eat some food. Just ignore that. Look at this big wad of food. Delicious. Well, we want the food to go down the esophagus. We don't want the food to go down the trachea. So when we swallow, When we swallow, the epiglottis becomes closed. It was in the open position to allow air to go into the trachea. But when we swallow, instead of being up, the epiglottis comes down. And when the epiglottis comes down, it means that food has only one direction to go, into the esophagus. So basically, when we swallow, the epiglottis comes down to make sure that food goes down the right tube, which is the esophagus. So when we swallow, the epiglottis goes down to close to make sure that food goes down the right tube, goes in the esophagus. Really important piece of cartilage. Okay, let's get into our lower respiratory tract, which for our purposes, we're considering starting with the trachea and going down into the lungs. Lower respiratory tract. Okay, so we had the trachea. We did bring air into the nose, into the pharynx, into the pharynx, and now we get into the trachea. This is your windpipe. We're not going to call it that. We're going to call it the trachea. Please take note of its structure. Really important here. Up to this point, we haven't really had to have much cartilage covering. We did it in the larynx because we wanted to protect our voice box. But now, looking at the trachea, it is covered on the front anteriorly by these cartilaginous rings. These rings, however, are C-shaped. So if we looked at a cross-section, the cartilage goes almost all the way around, but the back of the trachea is actually muscle, which we're going to look at in a minute. And of course, the function of the trachea, it's another passageway. This is how we're going to bring air into the lungs. And what are the functions? Well, this is our final place to continue the process of filtering, warming, and humidifying the incoming air. Of course, the inside of the trachea is going to be lined with cilia to help do the filtering. Here's an actual look. It almost looks like, plush carpeting from the 60s. Or if you're a certain person of like my age, when I was in high school, we watched Austin Powers. Shag carpet, baby. All right, I'm a dork. And then if you look at the bottom here, we can see this picture. It's trying to show you all these cilia. And the cilia catch the little foreign particles. So in this view, the foreign particles are the red dots. And that yellow bit is like mucus. So the cilia sway back and forth. And as we bring in air, particles get caught in between the cilia. And then the cilia all move in this direction at the same time. Right? All the cilia move in this direction at the same time. And that's what allows us to push those foreign particles back up. In all seriousness, if you ever, go to New York City, or maybe you live there, you're taking this class, or LA or something where there's more particulates in the air, whether it's smog or pollution or just dirt. You blow your nose sometimes. If you're in the city for a day, you blow your nose and then you have all this crap coming out of your nose. Well, that's because all those particulates have been caught by the cilia, and then all the cilia move in one direction and it pushes all those particulates back up, and then you literally blow your nose and you get rid of it. Pretty cool. So I didn't talk about this more, but I will right now. So I mentioned here that the front of the trachea has those cartilage rings. So if we do a cross section, the front of this trachea has those cartilage rings. The back is actually smooth muscle. And the reason that is, this is not going to be on the test, but if you're wondering, The reason that is because the back of the trachea has to be able to expand. I'm going to go back just for a moment to a picture like this. And what's cool about this program is I can erase, even if I go back, the wonders of technology. Sometimes it works for you. When it does, it's great. Let me go back further, actually. I changed my mind. Yes, down here. Okay. So we want the front of the trachea to have these cartilage rings. So these little blue things, cartilage rings. So it keeps the trachea open all the time. We want this trachea to be open all the time because we want air to always be coming in while we're alive, folks. But then the back lining is not cartilage, it's smooth muscle, which is flexible. Because what happens when you bring in food? When I bring in food, the esophagus expands. And the esophagus can't expand posteriorly because what's there? Your vertebral column, this bone. So the reason why you want the back of the trachea to be smooth muscle, which is flexible, is that when we swallow, that inner wall of the trachea, the back wall, can kind of push forward, which allows this food to go through. Not a big deal, but I think it's worth pointing out. Okay. We talked about that. Now, we're going to get further down almost into the lungs. So, again, I just like to review. We talked about bringing air in through the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, and the trachea. Well, the trachea are going to come down towards the lungs, and there's a branching. The trachea branches off into the bronchi. Bronchi is the plural, bronchus is individual. So it branches off into a primary bronchus, a right primary bronchus. This would be the right on the person, and this would be the left. So those initial branches are the primary bronchi. Primary, the initial branches. The structure is the same as the trachea. On this picture, those primary branches, don't they look just like the trachea? C-shaped cartilage ring, smooth muscle along the back. What's the function? Same thing. I mean, it's really important that we prepare the gases for our lungs. Right? And that's just what I was about to say. Everything up to this point has shared similar functions because it takes a lot to get that air clean, warmed, and humidified. And it has to be for us to be able to exchange it properly at the lungs. Okay, so when we talk about, go to yellow. So the trachea came down, and we talked about the primary bronchi. There's technically a secondary and tertiary bronchi, which we didn't talk about. But what I do want to point out is the branches I have in yellow, the branches I have put here in yellow are bronchi. So we talked about bronchi. These are in yellow. Well, once we get to the ends of the bronchi, then it becomes these microscopic branches. And they're microscopic, so you really can't see them. But coming off the bronchi are the bronchioles. So they are microscopic branches off of the bronchi. And I've put them in white, the bronchioles. Now, be careful, because they sound similar. Bronchi, bronchioles, okay? What's different about the bronchioles is that they are smaller, whereas the bronchi are larger. The bronchi, same structure as the trachea, which means that we have those cartilaginous rings. But the bronchioles have a different structure. No cartilage surrounding them. Instead, it's all smooth muscle. So on this diagram, we can't really see the bronchioles because they're microscopic. But I've tried to indicate to you where they are, even though we can't see them. Coming off of the branches, the bronchi, I've put in yellow, are these microscopic smaller branches that I've put in white. And these are bronchioles. They're microscopic, they're small, they're tinier branches that come off of the bronchi. And the bronchioles are covered by all smooth muscle. And that relates to the function. The bronchioles continue to be a passageway, but because they're covered by smooth muscle, they can constrict and dilate to regulate airflow. Constrict means to narrow or get smaller. So if there's a time where we don't need as much airflow into the lungs, these bronchioles can constrict. We're always going to let some air into the lungs because we're always breathing. But if I'm sleeping, if I'm laying on the couch, I don't need as much air into the lungs. Versus they can get bigger. They can enlarge. If you're exercising, we're going to need to exchange more gas in the lungs so the bronchioles can get bigger. This is something that can only be done by these bronchioles because they're covered in smooth muscle, and smooth muscle has the ability to constrict and dilate. So because they can do that, not only are they a passageway for air, but they can regulate airflow. So cool, huh? I mean, I think so. So what we'll do is we're going to finish our structure in this first video, and then we'll come back in our second video to talk about function. So now we've gotten all the way to the lungs. Now the lungs are these squishy, spongy-like organs, right? Please know that the right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2. And the reason is because the heart comes a little bit into the left. So if I was going to draw the heart sits here, right? So because it kind of comes a little bit more to the left, our right lung is a little bigger. So we have 1 lobe up here, a 2nd lobe here, and a 3rd lobe at the bottom, whereas on the left, we only have 2 lobes. Remember, it's always right and left as it would be on that person. And of course, it is in the lungs that we're going to be doing gas exchange. That's what you should know. There we go. Here's another cool picture. Again, I just like some cool cadaver pictures. I can't help it. I mean, check it out, folks. Here we have the heart. Look at the aorta, right? The main aorta, look at how big it is. You know, I've done the human cadaver several times, and honestly, it looked like the width of a garden hose. So it's huge. And then surrounding that, we have the lungs. So here's the left lung, and here's the right lung. And of course, what we're going to find out is our lungs can expand when we bring in air, and they can kind of recoil when we exhale. And because of that, we have to have some space, which is going to be our pleural cavity. But you get a good sense of, in our thorax, the lungs take up a pretty big chunk of it. And of course, protecting the lungs and the heart would be our rib cage. Here's our rib cage. Our sternum on the front. And then we have the vertebral column. I mean, everything's just squished together. Here are vertebral bones and a little spinal cord behind it. It's pretty cool. Okay. All right, let's finish up the anatomy here to finish up this first video. Let's talk about the space in the lungs and the covering. This is a very simplistic diagram, but that's exactly why I like it, precisely why I like it, because it just shows us very simply. We have two coverings over the lungs. The inner covering that I'm putting in green here, it's a connective tissue covering that clings directly to the surface of the lungs. Visceral pleura. The word visceral means inner. So there's this inner connective tissue covering called the visceral pleura in green. Clings right to the surface of the lungs. Then we have an outer covering called the parietal pleura. And this clings to the chest wall. So if I go back, the parietal pleura actually would be in yellow. It would line right here, whereas the visceral pleura lines right here. Visceral pleura is in green, parietal pleura is in red, which leaves a space in the middle. And we need that space to allow room for the lungs to expand. Really important. All right, let me just look ahead for 1 minute. Okay, so we're going to finish these last couple anatomy slides, and then we'll save the rest of the function for video number 2. Now, there's a little bit of physiology here. You just can't help it. When we talk about the visceral and parietal pleura, let me get my colors right. Green on the inside. Okay, so the visceral pleura was green, and the parietal pleura was yellow. And there's a space in the middle. Well, there's something that we like to call a negative pressure gradient. And let's give some numbers just to help. And why this is so important is because what we're going to talk about, this negative pressure gradient, keeps the lungs inflated. In other words, when you breathe in and out, these lungs never collapse. We would not want the lung to completely collapse every time you breathe out. No. So we always want the lungs to be inflated, even if you breathe out maximally. Your lungs are not going to collapse under healthy conditions because of this negative pressure gradient. All it means is the pressure, let me try and say this here. Let's first define these pressures. We have an intrapulmonary pressure. Let's say that the intrapulmonary pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. The intrapulmonary pressure is the pressure inside the lungs. I'm giving you an example of, in this example, the intrapulmonary pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. That's our unit for pressure, just like it's our unit for barometric pressure, millimeters of mercury. The negative pressure gradient says that the intrapleural pressure is always less than the intrapulmonary pressure. So we've just established what intrapulmonary pressure, the pressure inside the lungs. Well, we also have an intrapleural pressure, which is the pressure in the pleural space. So what this is telling us is the intrapleural pressure, or the pressure in the pleural space, is always less. If our intrapulmonary pressure is 760, our intrapleural pressure is probably somewhere around 756. So all we're saying is the pressure has to be greater inside the lung and a little bit lower in the space surrounding it. That's where we get this negative pressure, because the pressure on the outside is negative. It's less than the inside. All this means, you don't have to know these numbers, but you do need to know the concept. The pressure inside the lungs has to be greater than the pressure in the pleural space. Or look at it the other way. The pressure in the pleural space always has to be less than the pressure inside the lung. If the pressure inside the lung is always greater, the lung is always staying expanded. It's always open. Really, really important. Okay, so we've made our way, here we go, through the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, primary bronchi, other bronchi, bronchioles. Right? So here we're picking up with the bronchioles. Eventually, the bronchioles lead into the alveoli. These are grape-like sacs. And I think you've heard of alveoli before, right? Here's the alveoli. Right? This is the site of gas exchange. Very, very important. So we spent all this time bringing in the air, warming it, filtering it, humidifying it. And now we've gotten down to the lungs, and it is going to be inside these alveoli that we're going to exchange gases. And what do you notice? Well, we have this sac-like structure, which allows us to have more surface area, right? More surface area. The alveoli are surrounded by capillaries, which is really important because what we're going to have is, this is where we're going to have gas exchange. Some of the gases will diffuse this way from the lungs into the blood, oxygen. Other gases will diffuse from the blood into the alveoli, CO2. We have a lot of alveoli because we have a lot of ability to exchange gases. I'm not going to ask you that number, but it's hundreds of millions. Right? And this is where I'm just doing the same thing I drew over there. Oxygen is going to move from the alveoli into the blood. CO2 as a waste product moves from the blood into the lungs. All right. We're going to end this first video. When we come back for part 2, we will be talking about all the other functions. Good job, folks.